Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Sahra Ahmed Koshin, and I am representing the case study group. Newman, Varaidzo, Faniry, and myself. Our case study is looking at Zimbabwe land reform as a bold social policy reform case study. Our presentation consists of a number of components. To begin with, we will introduce the case study. We shall assess its policy objectives and what it wanted to achieve. We shall evaluate whether it was able to achieve what it set out to achieve and what it didn't achieve and why. We shall end with an overview of the current developments and emerging challenges currently present in Zimbabwe and leave you with some conclusions and lessons learned. Now, what is the social policy that we consider to be bold reform? Zimbabwe is coming out of a colonial legacy of racial land inequality in 1980 when it got its independence from Britain. So the government was dealing with a situation where highly fertile land was being owned by white commercial farmers, and black farmers didn't have anything. They had little communal subsistence land and didn't have access to bigger land. And so the government wanted to do something bold about this. It introduced this social policy reform where large-scale redistribution of land would be allocated to black people from white farmers, and there was a direct state intervention challenging market-led redistribution. But what did it want to achieve? This social policy wanted to achieve racial inequalities in land ownership. It wanted to address these problems. It wanted to address the issue of economic marginalization of black farmers. It wanted to bring about unequal access, policy to productive resources, and a need for redistributive justice. So the Zimbabwean case study was addressing essentially a colonial racial legacy of inequalities in land distribution, and the social policy advanced a leftist model in a predominantly neoliberal right-wing policy environment. It wanted to bring about change so that it could benefit its people. And you can understand that land is very important for Africa, and land is very important for African families, and that's the same goes for families in Zimbabwe. And the government realizing that its people was not having to such an important asset, wanted to bring about change. Land was a productive asset for agriculture. It was the foundation for livelihoods and rural development. People could grow food and have access to that food and also make some small money and sell the food. And so it wanted to benefit its communities and its people in these specific ways. Did the social policy achieve all of this? Yes. Our conclusion is that yes, the social policy increased black ownership of land. However, there were some shortcomings. For example, the social policy benefited politically connected better off groups. These were the people who had access to land, who had access to opportunities. These were the people who had money. And poor people were sort of sidelined and marginalized from ever accessing land. Secondly, there was weak monitoring, oversight. If you don't account for what you received or what you are giving out to people, and then there's the potential for corruption. And then finally, the social policy did not address gender issues, and we looked at everything through a gender transformative social policy lens, where we concluded that even progressive redistributive reforms can reproduce inequality if gender is not explicitly integrated into policy design. Can you imagine only 20% of this land was allocated to women? the social policy reinforced patriarchal land ownership. Zimbabwe being a very patriarchal society where women had little say in the public domain. And the other important thing to consider is that the post-independent land resettlement policy in Zimbabwe was shaped by customary norms and patriarchal systems where land permits were mainly issued to married men as household heads. And as a result, women could only access land under restrictive conditions. For example, if they were widowed, divorced, or unmarried. And this reflects a policy design that reinforces gender inequality rather than transforming it. And we conclude, therefore, failure to address women's practical and structural barriers to resource access, like land, credits, and services, can benefit the entire family. And so women were largely excluded from the social policy framework that was working for the majority of people, but not working for women. The majority of men, not for women, for these reasons. And so we have this picture here from the book, from a book. We got this picture from a book. This picture gives a very good design, an idea of the situation that we're discussing. It is saying that this lady with the baby is saying, I must divorce my husband in order to get my own piece of land. The reason is that she's saying that is because in her home, in her household, if she wanted to own land, this can only happen to her. This can only be given to her husband. So divorce the husband to get land. So this reflects a policy design that has totally disregarded the inclusion of women owning land and how important. And yet that women are the ones who always dig up the land, take care of land, do agriculture, and so forth. So the current situation in Zimbabwe is that the government is issuing land title deeds at a cost, and this excludes poor farmers because not everybody can access these permits that come at a cost. And people are having a lot of debt, so people have to take loans, the informal lenders, and it's a vicious cycle of borrowing money and not being able to pay it back. What are the key takeaways? The key takeaways are the social policy was bold but incomplete reform. It was transformative potential was undermined by reform addressed race, not gender equality. And there was weak implementation, and the lesson learned here is that equity must include both race and gender. So what we are seeing here is that while Zimbabwe's land reform addressed social injustice and challenged neoliberal orthodoxy, it fell short as a transformative social policy and emerging class-based inequalities. It created actually new inequalities because it advantaged those with capital, with money, bank loans, and so forth. It forced poorer farmers into debt, into bank loans, and informal lending. It also reform addressed race and not gender inequality. As we conclude, we leave you with some ideas and some food for thought, and leave you with two questions. We ask, can land reform be truly transformative without gender equity? And what would a gender responsive land reform look like according to you? Thank you for listening.